All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome, 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 and thank you for joining us today. We are back for another segment of our book talk, and I am live streaming on YouTube as well. So if anything happens to our Periscope, you can go to our YouTube channel, which is Church Love 333, and you can continue to follow the broadcast there. I just want to say good morning. I am fighting a bit of a cold. So far, I've been winning, and I want to keep winning today. So I'm going to be taking some time to just take a sip of my hot drink for this morning. I hope everybody's having a great day. It is rather on the cool side here in the East Coast. And hope everybody is well today. That all is right in your world. We are talking about reflections on race, and we're going to continue that through, I believe, all the way to December. And then we are going to probably take a break and come back at the beginning, at the top of the new year, with our next read. So, for those of you who are joining me the first time, I am Shante Charles. I am an author, educator, pastor, professional artist, professional singer. I wear a lot of hats, so I try not to give myself one title. Good morning, Apostle. I've been enjoying your scopes, and unfortunately, for some reason, I'm not getting the notifications when they come on, but I be amening on the replay. But we are continuing our reading, Reflections on Race. The book we're reading right now is White Like Me by Tim Wise. Oh, man. And so we're going to dig back into this after we complete this, which should be in a couple of days. We should complete this maybe by Monday. We're going to dig right into Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. This is going to be the last book we read for the year, Between the World and Me, which is another reflection on the racial climate. Now, a lot of people don't realize that I've been doing these book readings probably almost for about 80 days now, and it was a specific assignment for me to read. As you can see up here, I am an author and I have books of my own, but I'm not reading books of my own because this is not a time this is not a time for promoting my books, but this is a time for the matter at hand. And I believe that these readings have been helpful, these discussions have been helpful in light of the climate that we find ourselves in now. A lot of people did not realize how very racially divided our nation was. And so I think actually this election woke some people up to the realization that we do have a real problem in our country. And in that, I want to say that because we have this problem in our country, had the other person been elected, I honestly believe that some of us would have just simply gone back to sleep on the issues that are at hand. But because they were not elected, it actually put some fire under the feet of those who may have been a little bit lackadaisical in addressing these particular things. So that being said, we are, yes, well, the Lord is the one that told me to start reading these books, and reading them aloud. And so we started out with MLK's writings. And if you aren't familiar with MLK's actual writings, I would suggest that you familiarize yourself with his book, Why We Can't Wait. For familiarize yourself with his book, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here? And then their third book that we read was Radical King. And so right now, we are reading Tim Wise's work. Tim Wise is a white man who's an anti-racist activist. He has been fighting against white supremacist groups for probably about 25, 30 years now. And so he is reflecting on his own life, his own privilege as a white man. And he has actually given some warnings that are prophetic even right now. He warned about David Duke. He was one of the people, he's based out of Louisiana, but he was one of the people that was instrumental in making sure that David Duke did not get elected the first time. Well, if you all have been watching the news, you will know that David Duke reappeared in the news last year, and he ran again for a seat in government again this year. And he specifically said he felt this was the time to reinvigorate, to start his own political career because of President-elect Donald Trump. And he is one of those people that is applauding the election of Donald Trump because he knows what that means for white supremacist groups, the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, the alt-right. If you haven't heard that term, you need to check out what that means. Who are the alt-right? Stephen Bannon, the man that Trump just tapped to be his senior political strategist, is an alt-right member. He's an open white supremacist. He doesn't hide anything. So I find this reading actually to be somewhat prophetic because all of the things he's talking about in here, when this book was published in 2008, we're now seeing some of these same things here in 2016. So we're going to, yes, Stephen Bannon. He is a open white supremacist. He hates Jews. He hates black people. He has beat his wife. Yeah, and so this is the person we have advising, who's going to be the senior strategist for advising our president. So people need to pay attention. People need to stay awake. This is why people are saying we need to continue to push back. We don't need to be silent. We don't need to assume that because some plans have now been put out to quote unquote help a black America, you better read through the lines. Read the plan and understand the coding in the plan. There is code language in that plan. So please be aware of these things. He has put out a plan for Black America. Please look up the plan, go and read the plan, and you will understand that there is coded language in there that this plan is not going to be good. Okay, there is some intent behind the words, and you're going to see some things attempted to be reinvigorated through this plan that is not going to be good for Black Americans. And I'm talking to us because I'm a Black American. So there are other things in the plans that aren't good for other people, but he has a specific plan for Black America that you all need to read and take a look at. All right. So at this point in time, we are going back into our reading for today and looking at Tim Wise's life. This is autobiographical as well as informational. So if it doesn't interest you, it's okay. You can get off. If you are interested or you have to go or you have to come back, that's fine. You can come back and catch the replay. Tim Wise, yesterday we talked about journalism because he is also a person who is a journalist. He does lots of writing and articles, and he talked about the integrity of journalism and making sure that you as a journalist or you as a person who writes is not being coerced into writing in such a way that you are creating bias against a minority group. So that's one of the things that he talked about yesterday. That's one of the things we covered this week. He was talking about what happened with 9/11, how there were white supremacist groups that were excited about 9/11, but you never heard of them in the news. They never got reported on. That they too were excited about the destruction of America. Because if you don't understand the thing about white supremacists, they don't like how America is going either. And so their goal is to create a new America that favors them. So he was talking about this and how nobody was reporting on it because that quote unquote was not the story. They wanted to frame everything in the news during that time as if it was simply an Arab and Muslim issue. So that's what happened because some of the journalists went along with that plan. Yesterday, he talked about, because he lives in New Orleans, he was there during Katrina. Yesterday, he talked about the fact that there were people that were barring Black Americans from leaving their parish when the levees broke, and that there were white vigilante groups that were literally shooting people on sight because they assumed that everybody was a criminal. That did not get reported widely in the news, that people were taking the law into their own hands and they were shooting people because they felt like, hey, this person's coming from another neighborhood. If I see him in my neighborhood and they don't look like me and I've never seen them before, I'm going to shoot, no questions asked. He talked about how some of the people who were walking out of their parish to try to get to another section, how they were actually barred and banned by law enforcement from leaving their parish. So the number of deaths that happened during Hurricane Katrina was not simply because of the levees breaking. Some of the deaths happened because you had citizens that were taking matters into their own hands, which didn't get reported. And you had people who were trying to escape, who did not have cars. They were trying to walk out and escape. They were told to go back. So those are some things we talked about yesterday. Talked about reporting and how reporting happens and how that can shape the viewpoint of the people watching, that can shape the narrative. And I talked about the fact that when I was in Hurricane Andrew as a young person, living in South Florida, living in the ghetto, my family was poor. We didn't have a car. Most of the people around us did not have a car. So it wasn't like we could escape before the hurricane hit. And the area that we were in received services and received help pretty much last. Why? Because usually in a natural disaster, the poor are often the last people served. You would think it would be the other way around. Yeah, for the people who have money and cars and can get on planes and go somewhere else until their house is fixed and all these different things. No, the poor were served pretty much last. Okay, we were the last people to get services. We were the last people to get electricity. So we went without electricity for several months. The National Guard had to come serve us food for several months because you didn't have anything as far as resources and supplies. So those are the kinds of things, again, that do not get reported widely in the news. Yes, ma'am, months. We had to turn on water hydrants. My grandmother actually received a community award for helping people, helping the elderly to get water, to stay warm, those kinds of things. So we had to turn on fire hydrants to get clean water. People took their baths in fire hydrants for months. We had to build a makeshift shower stall. These are the things, again, that don't get reported in mainstream news. So when people are skeptical about what they hear and what they see, they have a reason to be skeptical about what they hear and what they see. And in the season that we're in, exactly, in the season that we're in, you have to check the sources of information that you're getting. Again, I try to do that as much as I can, and then I have some people that will come behind me and help me, and they'll say, hey, here's, you know, an article that shows a bigger picture of what actually happened, because people are just taking bits and pieces and putting together their own story and calling it news. So in this hour, you have to be Very careful about the news sources that you are going to receive your information, because not everything is being reported. That being said, let me now go back to our reading, and he's going to pick up here talking about those who were left stranded after Hurricane Katrina. So that's where we are in the reading. So let me begin. By Thursday, September 1st, most who were stranded at the New Orleans Convention Center had no food or portable water, and what provisions existed at the Superdome had run out, yet to be replaced by FEMA. Indeed, President Bush's FEMA director would say later that day that he hadn't realized that there were people trapped in such centers until that morning, despite the fact that the rest of us had been looking at them on national television for 72 hours. Please think about what he just said. Because there are churches right now, again, this is researchable. There are churches right now who have partnered with FEMA, who have agreed that should a natural disaster happen, they're either going to make their church a FEMA camp, or they're going to direct their parishioners to a FEMA camp. Now, these people, he's telling you, were in the New Orleans Convention Center without food or portable water. And the FEMA director at the time said he did not realize there were people trapped there without food and water. But Tim Wise is telling you everybody else knew because they were watching it on TV for 72 hours. So even in that convention center, people died waiting on food and water. It's about to get real in America, whether people realize it or not. So I'm glad we're reading this. Let's keep reading. When desperate folks attempted to get into food pantries at the convention center, knowing that the supplies would spoil and never be used for their original purposes, National Guardsmen aimed guns at them and told them to step away from the food or we'll blow your heads off. According to reports from those amongst the crowd, things got uglier by the minute. Meanwhile, I wondered why there was no apparent presence of the Red Cross in the city, either to provide relief supplies or tend to the. There were reports of their activities throughout the rest of the Gulf Coast and in parts of Louisiana other than New Orleans, but nothing in the Crescent City itself, which seemed bizarre. Rather than a structured relief operation, the task was falling to private citizens, like country music singer Harry Connick Jr., who drove into the city to bring supplies to the stranded when no one else would do so, or like my former boss at the Louisiana Coalition, who did the same. Lance and his family would never flee the city and would make several relief runs downtown, seeing firsthand the orderly and largely peaceful way in which desperate folks were behaving and trying to survive. The need for private citizens to fill the relief gap had been intensified by the absence of the Red Cross, whose absence Lance discovered had been deliberate, the result of a relief blockade. Do you hear what I'm saying? In other words, let the stranded die. So those of you who the Lord is saying, gather supplies, gather instruments, gather water, gather non-perishable items. If God has told you to do that, can we get you to be obedient and do that? Listen again to what he said. The need for private citizens to fill the relief gap was intensified by the absence of Red Cross. So yes, are we going to need private citizens who will be ready and prepared to serve and to help their neighbors? Yes. Are you going to be able to serve and help your neighbors if you harbor hate in your heart? If you are convinced that everybody is against you? If you are convinced that all white people are evil, how many neighbors do you think you're going to be able to help? If you're convinced that all black people are thugs and criminals, how many neighbors do you think you're going to be able to help? Okay, I'm going to keep reading. Though he tried to get media to cover the blockade as a story of institutional injustice, few agreed to discuss it. This, despite the fact that the evidence for the embargo was right there on the organization's website, where no one could read that the Department of Homeland Security continues to request that the American Red Cross not come back into New Orleans following the hurricane. Our presence would keep people from evacuating and encourage others to come into the city. Government officials more desirous of evacuating the city than helping the sick and dying told the relief group on the planet to stand down and to do nothing within New Orleans. Nowhere else in the hurricane zone was this order given, but it was given there. It was hard to avoid the conclusion that the demographic makeup of the affected might have had something to do with the different levels of concern. Keep in mind, this is the same Red Cross American branch that took millions of dollars for Haiti's relief and built themselves a nice apartment for their relief workers and took the rest of the money and gave the Haiti citizens tents to live in. Tents. T-E-N-T-S. They gave them tents to live in. So that when this hurricane hit this year, 1 million Haitians died because they didn't, first of all, they did not have proper housing. So this is why many people no longer trust Red Cross American branch to help people of color. This is why specifically Haiti has said, do not send your money to Red Cross America if you want to help us. All of this is researchable. You can Google it. Okay? So they're telling you, he's telling you specifically that Red Cross was told not to go back and help the sick and dying, specifically in New Orleans, where the population at the time was predominantly poor people of color and people of color. Let's keep reading. That afternoon, I went with Christy and the girls to a local Mexican restaurant, La Paz, for lunch. I had been riveted to the television for the better part of 3 days by that point, not even going out of the house, and needed a break from the coverage. As we waited for our food to arrive, I couldn't help but overhear the commentary from the table to my left, filled with 8 employees from a local call center whose compassion for the suffering masses in New Orleans had clearly been exhausted. The group prayed over their food because, after all, God was responsible for the flakiness of their sandwich, and then proceeded to heap scorn upon the people of New Orleans in ways that managed to only thinly veil the race and class bias at the heart of their critique. Between repeated amens, the white men and women, the former appropriately preppy, and the latter appropriately made up with big blonde hair, bangs reaching for Jesus, wondered why the people of New Orleans hadn't left, or why they were looting rather than helping one another or shooting at relief helicopters, a story that turned out to be untrue. People on rooftops have been using guns as makeshift flares to gain the attention of helicopters, not to bring them down. One of the men attempted to draw a contrast between the decency of New Yorkers in the wake of 9/11 and the quote unquote savagery of folks in New Orleans amid the current tragedy, and wondered why the difference. The neatly coy female to his right quickly offered up an explanation. Well, Buffy explained, it's probably because in New Orleans it's mostly poor people and they don't have the same regard. Regard for what? I wondered to myself. For life? For the sanctimonious and self-righteous consumption of chips and salsa? She then inferred that police needed to shoot all looters. As I watched guacamole tumble from her mouth, she trying hard not to accidentally scrape off any of her lipstick, her table mates praised the Lord at her suggestion. That they were not struck down, I believe the biblical term is smote, right then and there, may be the best evidence one can muster that there is a God, at least not one that actively intervenes in the affairs of mankind. Because I know that if I were God, there would have quickly been an albeit smoldering 8-top at the Nashville La Paz that afternoon. Our food had come by now, but my appetite had vanished. I picked at the edges of my dish, unable to shut out the contempt a few feet away. Chris asked what was wrong, but I just grunted something about not being very hungry and that I was listening to the table next to us. Our children continued to eat. After a few more minutes, I looked up, unable to bear any more, and told them to hurry, that I really needed to go. I knew that if I stayed there any longer and had to listen to any more of this foolishness dripping from the call center lunch bunch, I was going to end up making a scene. 4 days into the tragedy, a tragedy that was devastating the place and many of the people I loved, I was on edge and I knew I wouldn't make it much more to snap. Had I been alone or only with Christy, I might not have cared. Sometimes dumping queso on a person's head can be a relief. But with the girls in tow, only 2 and 4 years old, I knew that such an aggression and inevitable expulsion from the restaurant would only manage to scare them. I also knew that as a writer, I had better ways to get back at them than assault, be it verbal or physical. I was starting to shake by the time my family finished their meal and we stood up to leave. I glared at the table as we passed by, but to no effect. They never looked up from their bean burritos and never stopped speaking about the people of New Orleans as animals unworthy of concern. I told Chris that I needed her to drive. As we pulled away from the restaurant parking lot, I broke down, tears cascading down my face as my sobs turned to early stages of hyperventilation. Rachel asked what was wrong, having never seen me cry before and certainly not like this. Christy tried to explain it to her. You know those people we saw on TV in New Orleans where Daddy used to live, who were standing on their rooftops and stuck in the water? She asked. Yes, that's so sad, she replied, the innocence of her words breaking my heart further. Well, Daddy's worried about them, and those people next to us in the restaurant were saying mean things about the people there, she explained. Why would they say mean things about them? Ashton wondered. Because some people just aren't kind, was all I could think to say. I knew the answer was more complicated than that, and one day I would have to explain it to them in greater detail. But in that instance, that would have to suffice. Over the next few days, the narratives that began to develop from the Katrina tragedy showed how little most people understood either the city of New Orleans itself, its people, the political system under which they live, or the history of race and class subordination in America. On the one hand, right-wing commentators holding forth the nation's airwaves took the opportunity to bash the people of New Orleans for their dependence on government. To the Rush Limbaughs of the world, the welfare state had sapped the individual initiative of the people there, and that was why they had remained behind, waiting on the government to save them. After all, he and others argued, they were living off the public anyway. Having lived in the city for 10 years and having worked with some of the poorest people there, I knew how incredibly and criminally inaccurate this was, but also realized that there would be very little chance of countering it. So ingrained were the race and class biases of the larger white public. Facts don't matter to the pundits or to those who hang on to their every word like pliant sheep. For instance, no one mentioned that prior to Katrina, there were only 4,600 households in the entire city receiving cash welfare payments. This out of 130,000 Black households alone, which means that if every welfare recipient in New Orleans had been Black, and they weren't, less than 4% of such households actually qualified for the derision of those talking about them. And of those few receiving such benefits, all right, our Periscope has stopped. So let's try to get it back up. All right, we're back. Let's see if we can get, thank you guys for coming back in. My Periscope stopped. I'll read that section again. I'll start at the beginning of it. Thank you for coming back in. Thank you for coming back in. Let me start at the beginning of that section where he's talking about those who are accusing those in Katrina of not leaving the city for being dependent on the government. That's what he is talking about. Thank you for rejoining us. For those of you coming in for the first time, we are reading from White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. He's talking about what happened with Katrina, those who were left behind. No one mentioned prior to Katrina, there were only 4,600 households in the entire city receiving cash welfare payments. This out of 130,000 Black households alone, which means that even if every welfare recipient in New Orleans had been Black, and they weren't, still less than 4% of such households would have qualified for the derision that they were receiving. And of those few receiving the benefits, the average annual amount received was a mere $2,800 per household, hardly enough to have managed to make anyone lazy. In the lower Ninth Ward, one of the hardest hit communities and the place about which so much was said and so much of it was inaccurate, only 8% of the income received by persons living there came from government assistance, while 71% of it came from paid employment. In other words, folks in New Orleans were by and large poor in spite of their work ethic. 40% of the employed folks in the lower ninth worked full time and had average commutes to and from work of 45 minutes a day. But the media did not tell us this. I had to discover it by looking at the relevant Census Bureau that investigative journalists were too busy or uninterested to examine. So what he's saying is this whole picture that was being painted, that these were just poor, lazy, welfare benefit people who were just too lazy to leave the city, so they deserved to die because they didn't want to leave the city in New Orleans, was simply not true. Most of these people were hardworking people. They were working full time, and in spite of their work ethic, they still remained poor. This was not reported. I know I personally didn't hear any of this reported. All I heard was people are too retarded to leave the city, so they deserve to die. That was most of the reporting I heard concerning Hurricane Katrina. But they didn't tell you that the majority of the people living there didn't have cars. They didn't tell you that they refused to use the buses in the city to bus people out of New Orleans. Things you didn't hear in the news. On the night of September 2nd, during the concert for hurricane relief, broadcast across the nation, hip-hop artist Kanye West injected another narrative into the discussion, saying what had been on so many folks' minds, but which few had been willing to verbalize. Christy and I were lying in bed, watching the concert, when suddenly West, standing next to a stunned Mike Myers, he of Austin Powers and Saturday Night Live fame, went off script discussing the media representation of looting and the way in which it stoked racial stereotypes. It wasn't what the cue cards in front of him said, but Myers rolled with it, picking up at the end of his speech with another plea for financial contributions. Once Myers finished reading his card, West blurted out the line for which he became instantly infamous in the eyes of many, including the president: "George Bush doesn't care about Black people." I have to admit that when we heard those words, both Chris and I roared. I, for one, laughed so hard I almost fell out of the bed. Although I knew the comment was simplistic, the fact is what was happening was less about any one individual bias and more about a systemic and institutional neglect by both major parties that had jeopardized the lives of mostly Black and poor folks in New Orleans. It provided a moment of almost comic relief. It was so unexpected, and the look on Myers' face as he realized what had just happened was priceless. The comment would be edited out of later rebroadcasts, or even the first broadcast on the West Coast later that evening, but by then it was out there for good or ill. By the next week, other narratives would be launched, some of which were well-intended but ultimately wrong. Filmmaker Spike Lee, for instance, would go on to make a wonderfully poignant film about the tragedy, was quoted early on as saying that what had happened in New Orleans had been a system failure of monumental proportions. Though I had always been a fan of Lee's films and most of his social commentary, I knew in this case that he had it wrong. For the displacement of hundreds of thousands of poor, mostly Black people in New Orleans to be considered a system failure would require that prior to the so-called failure, those individuals had been doing just fine by the system. It would suggest that the system had been working for them and not failing in the days, weeks, months, and years leading up to Katrina. But had that been the case? Of course not. In fact, it wasn't even the first time such folks had been displaced. Although most Americans remain unaware of it, mass displacement of people of color, especially when poor, has been a common theme in America, and not because of flooding or other so-called natural disasters, but as with New Orleans in 2005, because of man-made decisions. For example, from the 1950s to the 1970s, urban renewal and the Interstate Highway Program had devastated Black and brown communities in the name of progress, with hundreds of thousands of homes, apartments, and businesses knocked to the ground. In New Orleans itself, the I-10 had sliced through the city's largest Black communities in the 60s, the Treme and the 7th Ward. The Treme, the oldest free Black community in the United States, is bordered on one side by Claiborne Avenue, above which the interstate would be constructed. The Claiborne corridor had been home to 200 Black-owned businesses in its day and included a wide median known to locals as a neutral ground. It was lined with huge oak trees and plenty of space for recreation, community picnics, family gatherings, and cultural events. Once completed, the I-10 had destroyed what was, for all intents and purposes, a public park, 6,100 feet long, along with hundreds of businesses and homes. In the 7th Ward, home to the city's old line Creole community, residents saw the same kind of devastation, also from the construction of the I-10 along Claiborne, including the virtual elimination of what was once the nation's most prosperous Black business district. So what happens? What happens when construction happens in these environments? The black businesses get destroyed and displaced, and the black places where black people come together get destroyed and displaced. And then we turn around and we blame black communities for not having places where black people can get together peacefully and nonviolently. And then we blame the black communities for not having enough black businesses in the communities to sustain the communities. Do you see how that works? Okay, I'm gonna keep reading. No, there was nothing new about the current displacement, and it had not been the result of system failure. The people being affected had never been given priority by government officials. The system that had let them down so many times before and so consistently that indeed one could even say that what happened in late August and early September was perfectly normal. If a system was never set up for you to begin with, and then it proceeds to let you down or even injure you, that's not failure. Rather, it's a system operating exactly as expected, which is to say, it was a system success, as perverse as the implications of such a truth might seem. Lee's comments about the system failing were only outdone for their historical lack of perspective by the remarks of columnist David Brooks, who opined in the New York Times that, quote unquote, the first rule of the social fabric in times of crisis, you protect the vulnerable, was trampled. By what kind of fantasy world could allow one to believe something as pitifully quaint as that? For some, including poor black folks in New Orleans, every day had been a time of crisis. They had never been protected from crisis. So whatever social fabric he may have been referring to, it clearly had never meant much to millions of people whom he appeared only after Katrina to have discovered. Brooks went on to say that because of the government's failure in Katrina, confidence in our civic institutions is plummeting. But confidence can only plummet when one has confidence to begin with. And who among us, saddled with such an affliction, has this kind of naivety? Surely not the black folks in New Orleans, and surely not the poor anywhere. Only middle class and above white folks have had the luxury of believing in the system and being amazed when it doesn't seem to work as they expected. It wouldn't take long for revisionists to begin whitewashing the racial element of the Katrina story. First, you heard rumblings that the real issue in New Orleans hadn't been race, but rather class. Money, it was claimed, is what really determined whether or not you'd been likely to have suffered major property damage or displacement because of the flooding. And true enough, there was a definite economic element to the damage, with lower lying and mostly working class communities bearing the brunt of the inundation. However, within a few months, research from Brown University would bear out that race was an even better predictor of property damage and displacement than economic status, with African Americans far more likely to suffer either relative to whites. In New Orleans, 75% of the people in damaged areas were black, compared to only 46% of the population in the undamaged areas. In the mid-city, 83% of the population was black, and 100% of the area sustained damage from the flood. In New Orleans East, 87% of the population was black, and 99% of the community suffered damage. In the lower Ninth Ward, 93% of the population was black, and 96% of the area was damaged. Likewise, in Treme, Gentilly, and all of the communities with public housing, save one, significant damage tracked the blackness of the community. Among white communities, only Lakeview sustained massive destruction. 90% of the area damaged, while being only 3% black. By comparison, almost all the white Garden District sustained virtually no damage. 2/3 of white Uptown area had damaged less than 30% of the community. Audubon and University District remained untouched. The 80+% white Marigny had damage in less than 20% of the area, and the almost entirely white French Quarter had virtually no damage at all. So much for class being the main issue rather than race. While in New Orleans for a conference in the summer of 2006, I came across a second form of revisionism spelled out in the letter to the editor of the Times-Picayune. The author put forth the newest meme going around the city, especially among conservatives, namely that whites had actually been disproportionately victimized by Katrina and that blacks had been underrepresented among the fatalities, since after all, blacks had been 68% of the city's storm population, but comprised only 59% of those who had died. Whites, on the other hand, were merely 28% of the population before Katrina, but comprised 37% of the deceased. Intrigued by the claim and fascinated by the implicit racial animosity behind it, which seemed to suggest that black people had not suffered enough, I went in search of the statistics the author had used to make his argument. There appeared to be conflicting data, some of the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals and other data reproduced on these right-wing websites that had come from the Knight Ridder news service. While both sets seemed to suggest that blacks had died at rates lower, while whites had died at rates higher, more recent data from the state showed no real imbalance, with blacks comprising 65% of the dead and whites 31%, roughly equal to pre-storm population. But upon closer examination, which of course they saw no reason to perform, the problems with the argument became clear. Fact is, the dead were overwhelmingly elderly, with 3/4 of all fatalities concentrated in the over 60 age group. It was a statistic that made sense. Older folks are more likely to be in bad health to begin with, less able or willing to evacuate in the crisis, and are more susceptible to a major health event during a trauma. And since whites were far more likely than blacks in New Orleans to be elderly, that white fatalities might be slightly disproportionate should not have been a surprise. Once the mortality data was adjusted for age, so that only persons in the same age groups were being compared, blacks died at a much higher rate than whites in every other age category. But the ultimate revision began just a few months after the catastrophe, when whites decided that it was the city's black leadership that was racist, and especially Mayor Ray Nagin. The charge was leveled at him for his off-the-cuff comment during an MLK celebration that New Orleans should be and would be once again a chocolate city when displaced blacks were able to return. To whites, the remark was tantamount to saying that they were not welcome, and to prove how racist the comment was, critics offered an analogy. What would we call it, they asked, if a white politician announced that their town should be a vanilla city, meaning that it was going to retain its white majority? Since we would most certainly call such a remark racist, consistency required that we call his remark racist as well. Of course, such reasoning was sloppy. For a white politician to demand that his or her city was going to remain white would be quite different and far worse than what Nagin said. When cities, suburbs, or towns are overwhelmingly white, there are reasons, both historic and contemporary, having to do with discrimination and unequal access for people of color, restrictive land and house covenants, redlining by banks, racially restrictive homesteading rights, and even policies prohibiting people of color from living in an area altogether. 4 things that whites have never experienced anywhere in this nation were commonly deployed against black and brown folks throughout history. On the other hand, chocolate cities have not developed because whites have been barred or even discouraged from entering, but rather because white people fled those areas in order to get away from black people, aided in this process by government subsidized loans. So to call for a vanilla majority is to call for the perpetuation of obstacles to people of color, while to call for a chocolate majority in such a place as New Orleans is to call merely for the continuation of access and opportunity for the Black people who already lived there. It was especially interesting to note how Nagin's comments calling for the retention of a chocolate New Orleans brought down calls of racism, while the very real and active planning of the city's white elite at the time, people like Joe Cannizzaro and Jimmy Reese, to change it to a majority white town by raising Black neighborhoods in the flood zone, elicited no attention or condemnation whatsoever from white people. Nagin had actually been the candidate of white New Orleans, receiving nearly 90% of their vote, but less than half of the Black vote. This did nothing to assuage the anger over his presumptive reverse racism. He had promised to cater to white needs during the campaign and had been amply rewarded for doing so. Now that he was stating a simple truth about the cultural and historic core of the city and demanding that it be retained, his former supporters turned on him. As Nagin discovered his Blackness, white New Orleans did too, and it scared them. To hear many tell it, they were now the victims. This concludes our reading for today. Lots to think about, especially concerning New Orleans. So, if we have learned anything, we learn that narratives can be deceiving, that one of the things that we need to do as we are listening, especially with the news, at these narratives going forth, is we need to make sure that we are doing our own research. Many people ask me the question, are you surprised at the outcome of our elections? And I would have to say, no, I am not surprised at the outcome, because I understand the country that I live in, and I understand racism. And I did some background on the two candidates. And when you do the background on the two candidates, you find out a couple of things really quickly. Number one, you find out that the candidates are actually related. Yes, I said related, as in blood related, as in blood cousins related, which means to me that regardless of whichever one of them got in, you are either going to get overt racism or you're going to get covert racism. So I kind of saw this as two cousins fighting over which one of them was actually going to represent the United States. And so I saw through a lot of the debate issues and the accusations that these people are really playing a game. They're playing a game. If you do the research, you'll find out that all of the presidents throughout history are all related. They all trace back to the same bloodline, except for one. So what does that tell me? It tells me even though we believe we're living in a democracy, the truth and the reality is these people are related by bloodline. This is why you can run for president per se, but you will eventually see the candidates get knocked out by certain things. So when I saw that we got down to these two candidates who were related by blood, it basically let me know that this is a bloodline race. It's posed as a democracy, but we're not really a democracy. We're actually a republic. Okay, so if you go and go research what kind of government is the United States, and it'll tell you we're not a democracy. So those are some things we need to understand. When I started doing research on the president-elect and realizing that his father was a Klansman, this is Googleable. His father was a Klansman and got arrested at a protest or a rally or something back in the 1930s. So these people have already known. And I'm like, if I can go research that, surely the people who were vetting him as a potential candidate already knew that this was in his background. They just put it out there toward the end of the campaign, but they already knew that he had ties to the Klan. So I'm not surprised that the Klan endorsed him officially. Okay, that doesn't surprise me. I knew that a year and a half ago that his family was tied to the Klan. But if you do further research, you will find that a third of our presidents, 1/3 of our presidents that have been elected are all tied to the same Irish clan called the Ulster Scots, ULSTER-Scots. These presidents specifically come from the same bloodline in Ireland, from the same clan called the Ulster Scots. Why is that important? Why is that important? The Ulster Scots, when they came over to America, part of them formed what was called the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle had a plan for re-enslaving Black America. And not just Black America. The Knights of the Golden Circle have a written plan. Again, this is researchable. They have a plan over 100 years old to re-enslave Black America, Mexico, Haiti, and the rest of the Caribbean. Guess who came out of the Knights of the Golden Circle? The Ku Klux Klan. So you see, they're tied together. You have to do some study. They're tied together. So people ask the question, why is it, and this again is researchable, why is it that the Ku Klux Klan in America has never been officially declared as a terrorist group? Yet they have done more terrorism throughout the years than ISIS or Al-Qaeda on American soil. Why are they not declared a terrorist group? Why has no one ever in the history of America been convicted of lynching? Over 5,000 people were lynched. That is recorded in America. Why have these people never been brought to justice? We see the historical documentation with the people hanging from the trees. You see the pictures of the people who actually did the lynching on the postcards. We have the technology now that has facial recognition that can identify who those murderers were. So why haven't they been brought to justice? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves. And we need to understand what white supremacy is about, how white supremacy operates, why these people are not being charged for crimes committed, because some of them are still alive. And if you go back and you look at some of the images, you'll see that there are children standing under those trees of strange fruit. And as I have said before, those children are the seeds that you're dealing with today, who are continuing to perpetuate in their seed hatred. This is why you can have in 2016 kindergartners telling other kindergartners, we're going to ship you back to Mexico. You can have middle schoolers handing their fellow students notices of deportation, telling them to get out of the country. So you got to understand the root to understand the fruit of what you are seeing today. All right. This was our reading for today. I pray that you got something out of it. I hope that you will go and fact check me. Please Research this stuff for yourself. I get people that debate with me all the time about what I actually researched. So I always encourage people, do the research yourself. That way you will know for yourself. You will have that assurance for yourself that you know what you're talking about. And you will not, be wondering what is going on. So when people ask me, what do you think about them having a celebration party that they're about to have in North Carolina? The Klan is planning to have a celebration party about their president-elect. They're celebrating the fact that what they have been desiring for over 100 years is now out in the open. That is what they're celebrating. They're celebrating the fact that the alt-right, or the Klan in suits, as they call themselves, they're celebrating the fact that these people will soon be unleashed to have open hatred in this country. And so again, I'm not knocking anybody. I'm not condemning anybody for who they chose to vote for. All I'm saying is you clearly did not understand, in many respects, what you voted for if you voted him in. Clearly you didn't understand what you were voting in. And so when we see the protests, I don't get upset at protesters. Mainly the majority of them are actually white protesters, because they are getting a wake-up call. Oh, okay. They are getting a wake-up call as to what is actually in this country. Some of them are waking up for the first time and realizing that we have a white supremacist problem in America. So some of them are genuinely angry. So I'm not knocking what they're doing. All I'm saying is, Black people in this country, we have put our bodies on the line quite enough. So you want to go out there and march, you want to go out there and protest, MLK would give you a thumbs up, and he'd probably give you an applause, as long as you aren't tearing up people's property, because we don't believe in that. We don't believe in destruction of property, but peaceful protest, yes, we do believe in. So white Christians who supported Trump, I'm going to close out of this broadcast and I'm going to come back, Apostle, and I'm going to talk about white Christians who supported Trump. All right. So we're going to close this one out, and I'm going to come right back in just a minute with that broadcast. All right. Thank you guys for joining me today on our reflections on race. And I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. We will be back tomorrow as we continue to cover the book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son.